We all know the story by now. When Nvidia first launched the RTX 20 series of graphics cards, people weren't as impressed as they'd hoped to be. There were a couple of reasons behind this, of course. The first was an absence of software which would really take advantage of the Turing feature set. For example, ray tracing games were thin on the ground, and that's putting it extremely mildly. The other thing is that the price to performance ratio was somewhat lackluster. You can argue all day long of the benefits of Turing, but at the time, the only thing we had to judge the architecture on was the number of frames that were being produced on screen. Nvidia, of course, launched the Super Series in an effort to try and counter this. While I do think the efforts were pretty successful, you can make a very strong argument that the RTX 2070 Super, for example, is what the RTX 2070 should have been on initial launch. But, surprising literally no one, Nvidia then stretched this strategy down to the GTX 16 series of cards. In my hand is a GTX 1660 Super. This card essentially nukes both the GTX 1660 Ti as well as the vanilla GTX 1660. It takes the same core configuration as the GTX 1660, but improves the amount of memory bandwidth available by replacing the 8 Gbps modules with 14 Gbps, and also comes in around $50 cheaper than the GTX 1660 Ti, but only $10 more expensive than the GTX 1660. With that all said, let's take a look at the card. As you may expect for a custom AIB card, MSI's Gaming X takes the reference design specs but cranks things up quite a bit. While it still features the same 1408 CUDA cores, of course, the reference design runs at just 1785 MHz for its boost frequency. Yet MSI claims the GTX 1660 Super Gaming X will reach 1830 MHz. I can confidently say that these figures MSI have provided are quite conservative. We routinely saw clock frequencies hit high 1900 MHz to low 2000 MHz without touching anything on the GPU with default clock behaviour, though of course such behaviour is normal for Turbo Boost 3 of Nvidia. Other than that, the design is nice and fairly understated, which should allow it to fit in almost any case colour theme. Design and colour scheme are typical of MSI Gaming X graphics cards. A brushed silver looking backplate sporting the MSI logo, and while backplates aren't exactly great for cooling quite frequently, it does aid to the aesthetic of the card, at least in my opinion. More to the point, for someone like me who regularly takes their card in and out of the machine, it's nice to feel that you don't have to be so careful what your fingers are poking at the rear of the PCB. MSI have plopped 2 torque fan frees on the card, which includes their zero frozer technology, i.e. the fans don't spin when there's no load on the GPU. This is not unique to MSI, but it's nice to see. What it really means though is that the card pretty much is silent in almost all situations. Even under gaming workloads you'll not really hear the fans at all unless you manually crank them all the way up. We also heard no coil whine when overclocking the GTX 1660 Super Gaming X either. Other than that, the card demands a single 8-pin power connector, despite the 1660 Super running at just 125 watts TDP. As for outputs, we have 3 DisplayPort 1.4s and a single HDMI 2.0B. Not exactly a surprising output configuration for a Turing graphics card. So what did we actually get out of the GTX 1660 Super Gaming X for overclocking? Cranking the clock frequency up actually has less of an advantage in performance than the core clocks, given the bounty of memory bandwidth available for the card. Of course, your mileage may vary, but we reached 150 MHz extra on the core and 760 MHz on the RAM. If we started playing around with the fan curves, we could get an extra 20-30 MHz more on the core, but we decided 150 MHz was the frequency we would stay at. It was rock stable and also had zero impact on the noise levels of this particular sample. For our test system, we're using our typical setup. We're using an i9 9900K cranked to 5 GHz across all cores, thanks to Intel for providing the sample, and an MSI Z390 Gaming Pro Carbon motherboard, and thanks to MSI for the motherboard. This is paired with a set of Crucial Ballistics memory running at 3200 MHz and a couple of different SSDs, one dedicated to the OS, and games are also installed on their own drive as well, and of course all of the patches are applied via their respective distribution platforms. You should also know that MSI have provided this GTX 1660 Super Gaming X graphics card as a review sample. Although this is not a sponsored video, I do want to disclose the fact that they did send over this as a review sample, although it is being sent back to MSI after these tests have been concluded. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this card essentially replaces both the GTX 1660 Ti and the 1660 Vanilla. The GTX 1660 Super therefore makes a pretty compelling argument for itself for a decent 1080p high refresh rate graphics card. It can also power a 1440p experience, but most realistically you would need to turn down some of the bells and whistles if you are playing a recent AAA title. It's a real shame, honestly, that Nvidia have cut out features like DLSS for this card. Yes, I know that some people don't particularly like DLSS because it does produce a softer image, but I do think that the technology is improving, and I think that a card such as the 1660 Super would be a perfect candidate for this technology. If you're upgrading from a card such as the GTX 960, then the GTX 1660 Super is a totally different animal. And even more powerful cards such as AMD's Radeon RX 480 get left in the dust with Nvidia's cut-down Turing. If you're not just gaming, but do some productivity as well, the GTX 1660 Super handles things quite well given the price point. Not much slower in Maya, for example, than the much more expensive RX 5700, albeit naturally way slower than the bigger available Turing cards. We've actually done a larger analysis of Turing for professional usage, and you can find that linked in the video description. If you're not wanting to head towards the used market and don't fancy spending more than a few $100-ish on a graphics card, it's hard to argue with the value of the GTX 1660 Super. You can always debate all day long what is the sweet spot in terms of value. For example, the GTX 1650 Super is around $40 to $60 cheaper, but is also noticeably slower. So the low end of the market is always one of those situations where just a few dollars more can make quite the difference in performance. And if you can stomach the notion of dropping, let's say, an extra $100-ish on a card, then on the new market, AMD's RX 5700 or Nvidia's own GeForce RTX 2060 series become an option. But for this price point of around $200, it's hard to find much fault with the GTX 1660 Super, other than it is what the 1660 should have been really when it launched. If you are torn between laying out the extra cash and purchasing, say, the RX 5700 or saving the money, I would take a peek back over these graphs and then look at the games being released over the next several months for PC. Realistically, a high refresh rate 1080p FreeSync screen would match up with this card rather nicely. Frankly, I believe that this card pairs very nicely with a CPU such as the Ryzen 3600, and if you plonk in 16GB of fairly snappy RAM, you'll have more than enough performance for 1080p and even 1440p gaming, plus as well, lots of Grunt for productivity as well. But what about MSI's Gaming X variant of the 1660 Super? Overall, it's a pretty nice card. The fans are whisper quiet. The boost frequencies of this GPU hit almost 2 GHz out of the box, and of course, overclocking improves things even further. But given that this card is aimed at the budget market, $10 to $20 can make an awful lot of difference of whether you're able to purchase the card or not. My personal opinion is that custom AIB cards like this, given the fact that there is a hefty overclock that you can apply to it, and the fact that the cards whisper quiet, may be worth it to you, although obviously if you are getting closer to the $250 mark, then you have to start to figure out, well, do I save a little bit more cash, and do I purchase an RX 5700, for example, instead? That's kind of the thing with the lower end part of the market. $10, $20, $30, $50 more can always get you a rather large jump often in performance tier. And in the end, you can end up spending a heck of a lot more cash than what you'd originally budgeted. But yeah, I have no real complaints with the GTX 1660 Super Gaming X other than the fairly lengthy name. With all of that said though, hopefully you have enjoyed the video. If you did, then of course subscribe to the channel for much more content, and you can also follow us on social media. There are also links to the product on Amazon, so if you want to click on one of those affiliate links, it does give us a few pennies. If you prefer a written version of this review, then of course it is linked in the description of this video. But for now, I'm going to let you all go. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.